venue where community members, William and Mary students, staff, and faculty come together to interact, share ideas with the end goal of learning about and from each other and building bridges. We're so happy tonight to be able to host collaborative conversations, William and Mary's Highland. The panelists joining in tonight are John Ezard, Olivia Gabrimlek, Helena Boyd, and Alton Costin, who are William and Mary students. They're joining Jennifer Stacy and George Monroe Jr., who are members of Highlands Council of Descendant Advisors. Last but not least, certainly, is Dr. Sarah Bon Harper, who is the Executive Director of James Monroe's Highland. It is now my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Olivia Gabrimlek. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. To start our talk, I want to talk about the history of Highland. If Sarah, could you explain to us about how Highland came to be and how that evolution involves William and Mary?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to Jody and the Lemon Project for having us. So historically, Highland was James Monroe's plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia. Of course, Monroe was an alumnus of William and Mary. And so in 1974, William and Mary came to own the property in the will of its last private owner. Since then, William and Mary has operated it as a public historic site and currently views it as an opportunity to serve as a laboratory for public history, a way to engage in inclusive history and in narratives about US history that help us, as good public history does, to understand who we are and how our current world came to be. Our current conversation also moves us into the future, I think, and is as much about the present and the future as it is about history.
So following up on that, the present and the future, I want to talk about the people that help shape Highland's future. I understand that you have a council of Descendant Advisors. How did that come to be, and what role do they have today? And for this question, I pose it to George.
Yeah, essentially, what was in the news as far as some of the groundbreaking discoveries that Highland was making about the life and times of President Monroe, as far as his actual estate, and finding some of the different foundational elements of the presidential house. I personally saw this article in the local news, and so genealogy was something I was big on, and I knew that through our own family history that we were part and parcel to the plantation. And that was, I believe, it was in 2016, 2017 that we actually reached out and tried to see if there were any synergies where first could we actually start to answer the question of, okay, what happened to the enslaved folks that were there at Highland? And then it became so much more. It became one of collaboration, one of thinking about, okay, so how do you take these type of conversations that we're having locally and expand it to other family members who may have certain answers to questions that we have. And then from there, it just kind of grown. It grew organically into a descendant committee where we were invited to take part in kind of helping to shape the future. So I would say that's pretty much the way we kind of came together.
So I want to expand on that and talk about sort of the power that the Descendants Advisory Board has. What sort of decisions do you guys take part in, and how are your voices weighed in the conversation? Do you have a final say, for example? This question can be answered by either Jennifer or George.
Yeah, so I'll go first, and then I'll let Jennifer kind of fill in where I may have missed anything. I would say that the opportunity to participate in, kind of the strategic direction of Highland was something that was afforded to me as an opportunity. When we think about kind of retelling the story of Highland to include the enslaved inhabitants, you know, we bring a vital piece that you know, we have oral history that points us back to the plantation, number one, to help tell a fuller story. Secondly, we also take it as an opportunity to say, you know, how do we use these stories and inform, I would say, different avenues of kind of building transparency for all involved, so that way we can help use these stories to help inform worldviews for those that actually come and visit the site. Because it's one thing to kind of come in and, you know, tell about the life and times of Monroe, but it's another thing to talk about the folks that were enslaved there and their actual lives as well. And since we're living and breathing descendants, that gives us a unique opportunity to not only explore his kind of contributions to society, but it also talks about, okay, so what was the kind of the foundation in which gave him the time to actually be able to do those endeavors? And that's really the life and times of the enslaved folks at the plantation.
So the only thing that I would add to that is just, I remember, not early on, but probably after we had met several times with Highland, I remember thinking to myself, this is such a big undertaking and we have to understand our roles here. So first of all, it's shared authority. And I think that's important to kind of point out. And the other piece is that my role is certainly not, I know very little to zero about running a museum and, you know, and a historical site. And I remember having a conversation with Sarah because I felt this incredible weight of the shared authority and getting it right. And I just wanted to make sure that she understood that she would have to guide us down the path of the historical site, the museum aspects, but it was our responsibility to share what we knew was passed down from our families and our experiences. And as long as we bring that to the table in our endeavors so far, there's been nothing but absolute respect and certainly consideration and the respect of the shared authority. So I hope that helps answer your question.
It absolutely does. And I just want to follow up on that. You mentioned that you don't have experience running a historical site. However, Sarah, you do. So I want to ask you, in your experience, how does this Council of Descendant Advisors either adhere to the standards of other similar sites or deviate from that in terms of having that open dialogue and also allowing such contribution from descendants of the enslaved?
For me? Well, we work within a practice that George and I were fortunate to be a part of a symposium of several days hosted by Montpelier and run jointly with the National Trust for Historic Preservation that established really some of the basics and guidelines and a rubric for descendant engagement with research, interpretation, and of course, relationship in what we now call sharing authority. And we were lucky to be there at the beginning of that conversation, which was very early in our collaborations. And so that has formed what we think of as our responsibilities to a descendant community, and really is, you know, that's what weighs on me, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a sense of we have a responsibility to be open and to really take guidance from a descendant group on how we interpret history, the activities we engage in, and in the public dialogue about Highland. And just to jump forward a little bit, which I'm sure will come up, is, you know, when I'm asked to speak about Highland, as it's quite often public face, I invite a collaborator. I try not to go alone because Highland is now about what we all want to what we all want to say about history and, as I say, the present and the future. Other sites are doing this. We are really lucky in some ways in that we have not, all of these things are coming together at once. We had not already completed the site history. We had not already completed fancy new exhibits. We had not already created a descendant group before we started this work with Montpelier and the National Trust. And then it all came together at once in a really, in a way that feels like it's the right thing to do.
Okay, I have one final question before we shift our conversation. Can you please shed light on the financial relationship between Highland and William and Mary? I don't believe we covered that in in the first question.
Sure, absolutely. William and Mary is completely responsible for Highland. It's a property that it owns. Highland is one of the departments in William and Mary. You know, sort of publicly, a lot of the dialogue has been on the budget support that Highland requires right now in our efforts in the last handful of years of increasing the quality of our public interpretation, our exhibits, our operations, and so forth. So yes, there is budgetary support, although Highland also generates revenue in several ways on site.
Okay, thank you. Now to shift the conversation, I want to talk about some backlash, of course, with Highland, as all William and Mary students are probably aware of. One of the instances of this is students saying that if you're going to pay homage to history, as it sounds like Highland is attempting to do, that it should still be called a plantation because that is what it was historically. Why is it not called a plantation?
Would you like me to take that, or is that
Yes,
Jennifer? Okay.
Sarah and Jennifer.
Yeah, so Highland, oh, sorry, you did want Jennifer?
Oh, you and then Jennifer.
Okay, right. So Highland was historically a plantation, and we have to start from that place and acknowledge that, and I think especially examine that. And that's a lot of what Highland does, is examine the operation of Monroe's plantation. You know, it certainly is not run as a plantation now or anything of that nature, but I can certainly understand all of the reaction that that word brings up, especially among students, as I understand. And today, you know, we're very sensitive to such things, and we recognize that plantations in the past were terrible sites. And so our idea is to really start from a place of truth there, and how do we move that forward then into a productive dialogue? We don't get anywhere from denying our past, I think, either at a specific site or in any national sense. We get further by really examining it thoughtfully and bringing in many voices into the dialogue. And I hope that's where we are now. I think that's where we are now, and that's what we're trying to do.
I would add that, you know, I just wanted to share a couple of things. I remember, and I've shared this before, but I remember my mom, you know, just sitting there thinking, I wonder what were our ancestors thinking when they were here. And I also remember one of our cousins who's also on the on the committee, looking out across the field near the meeting space at Highland, where we have our meetings when we're not in a pandemic, and just his reaction to it. And it was such a deep moment, and he was really reflecting and thinking about what it was like to have our ancestors there working this land. And that was that's the realness of being there and being involved in this attempt to get it right. And like Sarah said, it's like coming from a place of truth. It was a plantation, no doubt. And there's nothing, we don't see anything wrong with being there, working to get the history right, because it is one-sided now. And our attempt is to tell a more full story. And part of that is being there where our ancestors worked, feeling the weight of that, feeling the power of that. And it's important. And I think I've said this before, that, you know, the last thing we want to do is to be there pretending that it's something that it's not. And I think there's a way to do that without having Highland called a plantation. We know that it was a plantation. Our ancestors were there working it. And so I think that's in the background playing all the time. So
I think someone in the Q&A brought up a point that we were just discussing earlier privately, is that the majority of these properties, or the properties in the area, were plantations, but it is not part of their name. And we were discussing earlier how historically, it wasn't called Highland Plantation, it was called Highland in the past. So that is simply the truth.
I also want to touch on, or I guess rather connect two things that we've heard so far. Sarah mentioned that Highland does have other ways of producing revenue. And to my knowledge, some of those ways have produced controversy. Would anyone like to address what the root of the controversy is and how it plays into our work? I guess this question would be suitable for Helena, because it's a nice segue as to how we got involved.
Oh, right, yes. So a lot of the backlash or the reaction against Highland has to do with its hosting weddings. It is offered as a site for weddings and private events in order to generate revenue on its, to sort of support and give back to what William and Mary gives to it. And so with the nature of Highland hosting weddings, and of course, William and Mary students did not know very much, if at all, about this place. You know, it was just a student who discovered in the auxiliary budget, like, hey, what is this? What is some of our student money, our auxiliary money going to? And so, of course, earlier this summer, in late June, a petition was published calling for, or, you know, just against Highland. And I think the reaction was that when you first look at it, it's this place that's being funded by William and Mary that students don't know about, that's hosting private events. It's a bit strange, and attention did need to be called to it. That's part of what the petition did. But I read the petition, and at first glance, it seemed, you know, in the wake of all of the protests over the summer, at first glance, it seemed legit. And so I signed it and reposted it and everything. But upon some further investigation, I found a very different story being told when I read about the descendant engagement. And so I began to become concerned about this, and I dedicated many hours to like reading everything I could find about this place. And I knew that this petition couldn't be the end of the story with Highland. And I wanted to do something about it, but I was hesitant to confront the petition author, a Black woman, about her work. And so I did what I normally do in stressful situations. I gave my best friend Olivia a phone call and asked for some advice. And she checked out all my research and then called up John, and then John called up Alton. And that's essentially how our student group is formed. And I think it's important that the record gets set straight by like sharing all of this. We've been involved in this for 4 months now. Having these conversations, working with like research and facts and thinking about how this can go forward to benefit the William and Mary community and the public at large. And so we think it's very important to set the record straight, because although the petition did bring awareness, there was the whole descendant side of the story that was omitted.
And I guess I'll pick up there because I'm the one who called. I definitely agree with Lena about the struggle to or resistance to allowing non-people of color into the conversation, which is of course how I got involved. I thought it was rather unfortunate but understandable that a non-person of color would find difficulty confronting this issue with a petition. And so in all honesty, I completely stepped in as a sort of a buffer or a shield. And I think that we'll talk a bit more about why it's difficult to include non-people of color in the conversation a bit later. But that was my initial purpose. And I also want to touch on or elaborate on why we are involved as students and what that means to be involved, because I think that that's been misconstrued a little bit. To be involved with Highland does not mean that we fully support every facet of the property of the institution. That's not what it means. What it means, at least for me, is that I see the education that's being done about historical wrongs, and I feel as though those highly outweigh any of my reservations. Specifically talking about the point of weddings that was brought up earlier. That was my biggest reservation going into this. I'm still not completely comfortable with the fact that weddings are hosted at a plantation. That's just a fact. However, it's also a fact that money for educational programs has to come somewhere. And although I'm willing to say, yeah, I'm not comfortable with that, or am I, and are we the students also willing to say, I'm not comfortable with that, so take more of my money, charge more for tuition or whatever you have to do to get the money so that this property doesn't have to do weddings. And I think for most of us, the answer is no to that as well. So I want to open this up to other students, and of course, Jennifer and George as well, to talk about any reservations that you have, and if they've been sort of resolved, or if they haven't, and anyone can speak.
I guess for myself, being a descendant, I'm still having a hard time drawing a connection as to why there's an uproar about weddings taking place at Highland. I still don't understand what the problem statement is there, and I still don't understand exactly what is the problem that's to be solved for. I think a lot of times, when you mention the word plantation in general, it does spark emotion and passion. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like, if we as descendants don't really care about weddings being performed there, I'd like to understand more about the sensitivities around the student population in terms of, the idea that weddings are being performed in Highland at this particular point. Like Jennifer said, we all agreed that is a plantation. Okay, that was its historical purpose. Now at this time, we're using it for something completely different that's not been done before, which is to work together with not only the administration, but work with the descendants to really tell a broader story and a broader history. Secondly, I look at that as an opportunity to pull people who otherwise might not have come to Highland for any other purpose to come and actually learn about the work that's being performed. So I try to look at this situation as something as being a glass half full, and that if you have these different targeted events set against a beautiful backdrop, which is what it is, despite the fact of its history as a plantation, to bring people in to really not only understand, the work that's being performed, but we're setting up different, stations and historical interpretations to help influence their worldview, which will hopefully lead to broader conversations about inclusivity, equity, and things of that nature. And think about the fruit that bears, all because it came up to the site for a wedding, right? So I'm personally an advocate of any and everything that would draw attention to Highland, to pull as many people to the site as possible, because the story that we're putting together is one of beauty, is one of reconciliation in many ways, that will allow other people to see an example of what being on one accord can look like when you start to talk about very conflicting measures of the past, but using that as a springboard to setting up different avenues of research, different avenues of engagement, and things of that nature for the general public that otherwise would not be there. So I personally would like to understand, the misgivings about having weddings there in that regard.
Well, I guess I will act upon that stance. And basically, the issue with it is lots of people find trouble grappling with such a joyous occasion happening in the same place at the same site of horrendous treatment. And so I think that that's where a lot of it comes from. That's where it definitely stems from for me. And I also want to include Alton and John in this conversation as well, because as they will speak to, I understand that George is saying that, it seems like it's not a big deal, but I think that there's a generational gap with reaction to this. And I'll let Alton speak more about that reaction.
Well, yeah. I believe that what's happening is that we have a group of students who hear plantation, hear William and Mary in one sentence. And that sort of, as George recently stated, it sparks emotion, because it is. And as we have all recognized, Highland was in fact a plantation. James Monroe did in fact enslave Black and brown people. But regarding the quote unquote backlash that a lot of students may want to place upon Highland, I don't believe that it's necessarily backlash. And I say that because I don't believe that students or people in general are particularly aware of the initiatives that are occurring. I feel that true backlash regards someone who is knowledgeable on what is actually happening versus what they believe should be happening. And I feel like what is happening is that people are coming into the situation where they don't necessarily have all the information to make sort of their stance, and they're going off of what they believe should be occurring regarding Highland. And I feel that oftentimes when it comes to people who don't necessarily know nor understand the magnitude of the work that's occurring, then to hear Highland and to hear plantation, William and Mary all in the same sentence, their reactions are warranted at face value. But as people, we can't just accept things at face value. Rather, we have to investigate, do research, and really find what is happening. And ultimately, this is a huge potential endeavor for Black and brown students at William and Mary, regarding scholarships, regarding research endeavors. And ultimately, it allows William and Mary to tell its full history and not just a slated version of such. We've really been touting, William and Mary has been touting the For the Bold campaign over the past few months. Well, to be bold is to tell a full narrative of history and to truly voice and speak to the mishappenings that were occurring at Highland while giving the voice to the voiceless, which were those enslaved Black and brown people. So I feel that when people really become knowledgeable and become truly indulged in what Highland is trying to do regarding telling the full narrative, then they can then begin to give any sort of backlash or recommendations. But when you come into a situation with your mind already made up, it's a little bit more difficult to provide constructive criticism.
Yes, I'd like to add a point to that. So, after I did, like on my own before like joining any of these conversations, I did like a bunch of my own personal research. However, it wasn't truly enough until I gathered people and then we had a conversation together. Having, I think, is, something we've been talking about as a group for for this whole time, is the importance of just having a conversation before you jump to conclusions. And you just have to talk to the people involved. I sound preachy, but it's important.
Yeah, I'd actually like to commend each of you for reaching out to get the fuller story. That was very important, and the dialogue has been very meaningful. I wanted to share that, you mentioned generational, and I think one of our goals that we have cited in our meetings is to bring the next generation to the table, to get them involved. And this petition, as difficult as it has been to discuss and deal with, it has brought a meaningful relationship between the students and Highland and the descendants has transpired. And it is a very meaningful relationship and an opportunity to engage the next generation, not just the students, and also the next generation of descendants, which is actually planned for future meetings. And I think about that kind of the same way I think about Highland, in the fact that it was a plantation. It's just so much more there. Nobody's putting it off to the side and brushing it over and pretending it away and that it wasn't. And yes, it is a beautiful space. And I remember when this discussion about weddings on plantations first entered the national dialogue, I remember receiving a phone call from Sarah asking what our thoughts were. I know I got pinged. I think George did as well. And I think that's an example of the shared authority. We gave very honest reactions to it, and George expressed exactly what it was. And so while I can certainly understand, the reactions that the students are having about having weddings there, I fully agree with Alton's assessment that and Helena, that get a full picture. There's so much more there, and there's so much more that has occurred as a result of the the reaction. And when we first talked about this and the student reaction, and we worried over it, I remember Sarah and I talking about the fact that we had to maintain faith that out of this moment that it would be something good. And I firmly believe this is the something good, and I hope that more students will be involved to in this and see the value. So
Yeah, just real quickly, I did want to kind of follow back up on the generational piece, right? Because I think for a second there, Olivia, you were calling me old, but that's all good. We'll talk about that later. But quiet is kept. I think that what you'll find, to Jennifer's point, is when you start to dig in American history in general, you're going to find that that slavery as an institution is just so embedded in its moral fabric that no stone that you turn over is not going to have some sort of, some sort of I would say some connection back to the enslavement period, right? So it could be weddings at a plantation, or it could be convocations at one of the chapels on William and Mary's campus, right? some point, somebody that was enslaved either serviced that location, built the location in some cases, cleaned it, maintained it, right? So at what point do you kind of draw the line? I would say that what we're embarking on hasn't been done before. You know, we're working together to tell a broader story, a broader narrative, and then be able to chart and recommend ideas on how you move forward. And basically what that means is and we've talked about this before, authentic truth telling. Okay. And so now, in order for people to hear your truths, now how do you make sure that they get there to actually experience what that truth is? Right. And so I think that's where we start to get to a place where you know, you can have more meaningful conversations when folks who haven't been reached or haven't considered these types of truths before are exposed to it. And I think that is what becomes more important when you start to think about, you know, forward-looking trajectories and understanding race relations in this country.
I want to touch on that quickly before we move on. I wholeheartedly agree about the authentic approach that's necessary to truly pin down this sort of issue. Like everyone has mentioned, we've had many meetings in private as well. And our very first meeting, actually, we had a very open and honest conversation where I asked Jennifer and George, you know, simply, do you feel disrespected? As of course Jennifer later pointed out, you know, they have ample control and authority as advisors to speak up if they find something that is uncomfortable. And I think that at the end of the day, that's the part that was really missing from the average student's perspective. You know, it wasn't until I sat on a Zoom call with everyone that I understood the depth of, you know, the contribution of the Descendant Advisory, which made me far more comfortable. But that's all I'll say on that. I want to give the floor to John to talk about the reaction that you've seen from the student body and perhaps speak on what you would like to see in the future in terms of the manner in which we converse about topics like these.
Well, what I'll say is that the reaction, it's not specific just to our generation or just to one group of people. It's kind of the common reaction that most people have in general when they're in a position where they're discussing something and there's a disagreement and one person thinks this way and the other person thinks that way and the two people don't agree. It's the approach that we have when we are having these conversations is not really effective. Because when you think about it and when you observe the way that these conversations are, we walk in with the mindset of, I'm correct, this person is wrong, they just don't get it. Let me hurry up and educate them and get them to understand why they're wrong and I'm right. And like the problem with that is, even if you are correct, you're not going to be able to, it's difficult to effectively convince somebody if you go in with that approach. And then especially because when you're doing that, you're not actually listening. And what I would say is, for these conversations to be more effective, we should approach them from the goal of, let me actually listen to this person. And instead of trying to convince them, let me walk in with the mindset of, I'm going to try to learn something from this other person and maybe even take the approach that they might actually be right and I might be wrong. And even if that's not true, when you have that mindset, it opens you up to find holes in your argument. And if you're correct, then you can make your argument stronger and then hope to effectively convince that other person why they could alter their viewpoint. So that's kind of the situation that we have. And it's like, you know, if everybody's reacting, everybody's angry, everybody is blaming each other, then, you know, we're not finding any common ground. And if each side's pushing against each other and no common ground is being found and we're blaming each other, then, you know, everybody places blame, nobody places ownership. How is the problem going to be solved? So the problem doesn't get solved. We kind of will go around in circles and like things stay the same. So maybe a different approach, try to find common ground with the people that you disagree with and try to empathize with them and, you know, try to understand where they're coming from. And maybe we can move the conversation forward and get towards a tangible solution instead of just beating around the bush, because it's not really effective. That's what I have to say.
And speaking of, you know, including everyone in the conversation, we've been queuing up audience questions, which I will now ask the group. We will also have a separate Zoom after this for spillover questions. So if your question isn't covered right now, feel free to join us and we will get to you. So the first question I have here is, would a plantation that held / owned your ancestors not be sacred ground to honor them and the work and service they provided? I believe that this question would be most aptly responded to by Jennifer or George.
Jennifer, I'd love it if you take this one and I can follow up.
Can you read again, the first part of it again, please?
Yes. Would a plantation that held / owned your ancestors not be a sacred ground to honor them and the work and service they provided?
You know, we're doing our best to make sure that happens. And Alton kind of used one of the phrases that I use all the time, giving a voice to the voiceless. And there's not a moment that we're not there working to make certain that we honor them. That's the weight that I've described, the weight that I've always kind of felt sitting at the table working to get this right. And there's no cookie cutting situation going on here. We are creating something right here, right now, that has the opportunity to be long lasting and to leave something for future generations. And so, yes, it is a sacred place and we want to get this right. And I'm probably not answering this question the way the student probably posed it, but I'm answering it from my heart, which is where what I want to be, you know, said in this moment. So, George, please.
I would say that, yeah, it's definitely sacred ground. There's no doubt about it. Not only sacred ground for our family, but for the other families and their descendants that had the enslaved work there as well. I do want to use one example. Think about the contributions of African Americans to this country that have largely been ignored, not documented, stolen even, right? This is an opportunity for us at Highland as descendants to talk about those contributions. Think about the fact that those enslaved were around one of the most brilliant minds that existed as far as the colonial period, and things they might have been within earshot of, right? Things they might have contributed to, whether you believe it or not. These are the types of things that we have an opportunity to actually say, you know what, these African Americans here, or these enslaved Africans here, had an opportunity to support not only Monroe's plantation, but they also work interchangeably with Monticello, right? Because a lot of the groups of families, they were linked. They were a community amongst two of the founding fathers and presidents, right? That's the story. That whole area is sacred as far as I'm concerned, and not just the plantation, because of the significance of who the people that they supported were. So yeah, I would definitely say that that's sacred ground there.
And so I have a follow-up question from the audience. Isn't the problem of weddings their participants' uncritical identification with the plantocracy? Is that okay to reproduce? This can.
Well, I think I would probably ask another question in return. How do we expect for them to learn anything about it, right? If they hadn't before the wedding taken an opportunity to do so. my position is more so from the standpoint of I'm going to use everything I can to get them to that plantation site, so that way they can hear this story, right? Because you're going to undoubtedly have guests that are curious about what's going on there, and they're going to want to they're going to want to read that website and see the narrative that's being painted there, a narrative that's actually, you know, that will have a part of Jennifer and I's kind of opinion and other descendants opinion of, you know, what's going on at that site, right? So for me, it's really, from my standpoint, about marketing, because if I can get you there and I can influence you and get you an opportunity to see that, hey, there's a whole kind of family unit that was there, and here's some of their stories, and here's some of their contributions, then I think we've won, because now they can take that back with them and have other conversations where they're going to be having in rooms that we never walk in.
The important word here is, you know, that keeps coming to my mind is dialogue. I mean, it starts a dialogue. I mean, and I agree with George. You know, once you're there, the idea is, we hope there's more. And I'm able to think of, I'm able to be on Highland, understanding that my ancestors, my American story on one side of my family started right there. And that my family, they were slaves, and they worked that land. And then I'm able to think in layers. And in thinking in layers, that's how you get to the place where there's this beautiful space there, and someone's going to come there looking for a place to have a wedding. And I hope they end with, oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was going on, that this dialogue was going on with the enslaved community, that there's this history there, that Highland is actually trying to get this right. And maybe it sounds like a fairy tale idea or approach. I'm not naive. I'm a very realistic thinker. And the reality is, and this is my reality that I'm expressing, that you can have weddings there, and you can also learn about history, and you can also understand that James Monroe was a founding father that owned slaves, and be able to think on all those different levels and operate on all those different levels. And I think that's where I come from when I'm asked the question about there were slaves there and you're having weddings. These are two contrasting things. And going back to what George said, where does this end? Because I can assure you, slaves helped build William and Mary. Are you going to tear that down and build and disrupt relationships over that? We have to think about this from that place and understand that I certainly applaud you for raising this as a dialogue, but let's take it to the next level, and let's continue to take this to the next level. That's what I hope is done here.
I also want to read some audience comments about this as well. So one says they also were sites of enormous strength and survival, as demonstrated by Jennifer and George, incredible descendants of the men and women enslaved at Highland. And they just pointed out, they don't have a question, but they wanted to point that out to people. So there's that. And then there's an additional comment actually from a member of the Council of Descendant Advisors, who says, my second great grand uncle lived at Highlands for many years. He was formerly enslaved at a neighboring plantation. He was married at Highlands, as were many. John Macy, former Lieutenant Governor of Virginia and a former owner of Highlands, was also a minister. He performed many weddings at Highlands, and many of those were for African Americans. I suppose this brings up a question that we may have to move to the Q&A session about, is there a difference between Black African American people holding weddings at Highland and non-people of color, and more specifically white people holding weddings at Highland? And I will just quickly check to see if there's any more questions or if we can answer that. Oh. No, there isn't. So if anyone, oh, actually, wait, yes, there is one more question. What is the size and makeup of the Descendants Advisory Board? And then also how and when was it formed?
Good question. Yes, so I think I'll take this. I think that, and Jennifer will definitely chime in. I think as far as the Descendant Advisory, I think we started putting some kind of formal shape around it in the latter part of 2019, early 2020. And it's made up of, it's really multi-generational if you think about it, to Jennifer's earlier point, where, you know, my father's involved, Jennifer's mother's involved. We have older cousins, our cousin Waltine is there. And then of course you get into my generation, and then to Jennifer's earlier point, we're looking for, you know, a generation after us to come in as far as descendants. So we think about the total size, I believe there's what, 9 of us, 10 of us at this particular point in time. And we're expecting that to grow as you know, family members become more interested in the work that we're performing, and looking to you know, kind of help, you know, bring additional kind of you know, assistance to Highland in terms of kind of telling a broader story of the descendant population.
I think I'm anxious about the next generation joining, and I think my nephew is planning to join is one of George's daughters, maybe?
Yeah, my daughter will be joining. She just turned 24. She's a graduate student at the University of Miami. So you know, when as she's able to, she'll be a part of the calls, and we'll be touching base with us as well. Yeah.
Okay, we have, I think, one more question that we can answer. There have been atrocities perpetuated against Black people in countless venues, including Central Park. The institution of slavery is part of every aspect of this country, whether the North or the South. Plantations are a symbol of those atrocities. We can't erase what happened, but what is happening with the Monroe descendants is a way of setting the narrative straight. What role can William and Mary play in supporting the descendants? I think that this question should be answered by the students briefly before our allotted time ends.
So yeah, I would say that the Descendants' voices are the most important in this conversation, or like they're just a very key element to understanding what's going on here. And if Jennifer and George were telling us a very different story about what was going on there, sure, like we'd be fighting a different fight. But I think it's for, I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but like William and Mary students can just listen to the descendants and everybody else involved, I suppose.
So I think we were asked this question during at another point in time, and I think one of the things that I hope is that, and I think when we first talked with the students, we talked about the fact that we don't do a really good job of actually spreading the word about the work that we're doing, and we asked the students to help us to do a better job of getting the word out using social media. We've talked about generations and being old, and I can tell you that using social media is not the first thing that comes to mind. And so that's one way that I think that that the engagement with the students can and has helped. And the other way is, I think there's an opportunity for education right there at Highland. And as long as William and Mary continues to support that engagement with the students at an educational level, we will learn and grow with each other. And we will continue to share, you know, the work that's being done there, so everyone knows what we're doing. And I think the more people know, the more dialogue we have with each other, the stronger the relationship, the more you know, the more that we bring to the country, to the world.
Yes.
oh, were you going to say something? I was just going to add something.
We have to wrap up to go to the other Zoom. I believe that our time here ends at 7:30, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Olivia, can I take like 15 seconds? Because I think I would be really remiss in not answering something specific. And I think there may have been a pre-question too about how can more students get involved and what, as well as how can William & Mary support this, which is to say that Maria Di Benigno, who's in the background here, together with Joanne Johnson at the Lemon Project, are teaching next semester. And there will be a lot about Highland in that course. And we can definitely look towards that for one way of more students getting involved and one way of William & Mary making sure that there is more dialogue about Highland.
And on that note, before this meeting automatically ends, I invite anyone who has additional questions to go to the Zoom link in the chat. We will see you there in just a moment. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you there as well.